Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on understanding popular culture, today we'll talk about Indian cinema mapping influence of national struggle for independence part 4. In the earlier lectures, we talked about the various genres of the films which were made during the colonial period and how these films, whether the mythologicals or devotionals, historicals or social religious themes, how themes which are concerned with the idea of social reform, how all of them they were also trying to project not only the ideals of the reform movements, but at the same time how they were also connected with the ideals of the national movement. At the same time, in the earlier lecture, we talked about the ideals of the censorship as well, that how the various kinds of ideals which were connected with the national movement and how these ideals they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and the colonial censors they were inimical to such kind of ideals of the national movement, and they did not want that these ideals of the national movement they be projected on the celluloid, and that is how various scenes, dialogues of many films which we also talked about in the earlier lecture, they were being deleted by the colonial censors. They were also fearful of the kind of contemporary developments which were happening across the world, especially the Russian Revolution in 1917, and thereafter the propagation of the communist and the revolutionary ideals. And at the same time, the American films which were talking about the ideals of democracy, which were also not in any way acceptable to the British censors, and this is what they did, that they rejected such kind of films as well. So we find that any kinds of scenes which were dealing with these revolutionary ideals or the nationalist ideals, whether in the American style stunt films as well, they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and Indians they raised certain concerns with regard to the import of the British films or the American films, that how these films they might corrupt the Indian morals and the Indian young minds which were impressionistic at such a very young age. And that is how they raised these kinds of questions, that whether these kind of projections on celluloid, whether they were some kind of a conspiracy in the context of the cultural policy, and how it may create that kind of an impact on the young minds of the Indian society. And magazines like Abhyuday and Film India, they raised such kind of concerns, and they in a way talked about the kind of attack. They also raised their concerns in these kinds of magazines like Film India and Abhyuday, both of them. They were talking about such kind of concerns, and they raise these issues quite regularly in their columns as well. We also find that apart from such kind of portrayals, British they were also concerned with the ideals of the national movement. They were also concerned with the issues which were concerning the Muslims as well, because they had felt during the revolt of 1857 that how both Muslims and the Hindus they came together to dislodge them from the Indian soil, and thereafter they followed this policy of divide and rule in a very consistent manner, so that any kinds of bonds of friendship and love between both Hindus as well as Muslims they may not develop to that extent that both of them together they pose a challenge to the colonial rule again. And what we see that the Khilafat movement in 1920, it provided some kind of an opportunity to unite both the Hindus as well as the Muslims. And we find that how British they tried to placate one community at one time in their policy of divide and rule, and they also became in a way sensitive to the issues that might offend the Muslims in terms of the portrayal of certain films. And this was also reflected in the film censorship as well, that they wanted to placate the Muslims that way. Any concerns which might be relevant in the context of the portrayal of the Muslims on the screen, they were being taken care of by the colonial censors, and they took care that such kind of scenes and the dialogues which might offend them, they might be deleted, and they may not be shown to the cinegoers. And we find that one or two Muslim members, they were there in the film censor boards everywhere, and their concerns, they were kept in mind when such kind of exhibition for the censor board was being taken place. And any kind of an offense to the Muslim sentiments was taken into account in the context of censoring a film by the British at that point of time. And we find that the film called Virgin of Istanbul, which was made in 1920, was passed by the censor board of Burma, but it was banned by the Bombay censor board, which thought that the certain ideas are likely to offend the Mohammedan community. So we find that some of the films which were being passed by even by another censor board, as the case of the Virgin of Istanbul was, but it was not in any way acceptable to the Bombay censor board, which in a way deleted the kind of dialogues or scenes which were not in a way suitable for the Muslim community. So these kinds of ideas, they were there at that point of time in the context of the colonial rulers, and scholars like S.T. Bhaskaran, they communicate that there was a film called 40th Door, which was made in 1925, and this was a story which was depicting the struggle between the Christians and the Muslims in the Middle East. And this was also proscribed first in Bombay and then in other provinces because it portrayed Egyptian officials in an unsavory light. So we find that how the colonial censors, they were sensitive to such kind of portrayals, and they were ever ready in that context. And these kinds of concerns, they were also being talked about at the official level. And these kinds of concerns, that how they can hurt the sentiments, they could be heard in 1933 in the Legislative Assembly in words of Sheikh Sadiq Hassan, that there is great resentment among Muslim public when scenes of haram life are depicted in films, and especially when historic Muslim queens and princesses are shown making love. So such kind of portrayals where these kind of portrayals where the sentiments of the Muslims, they could be affected, they were being taken care of by the colonial censors. And the Times of India, which was dated 29 November 1935, talked about a scene 250 feet in showing several Muslims sitting around a table in a cosmopolitan club and drinking liquor. It was also deleted from a film which was produced in Bombay. And censor authorities, they opined that they had this kind of an opinion that no Muslim should be shown drinking liquor in a film, and it was meant for public screening as it would offend the Islamic sentiments. So such kind of portrayals which might offend the Muslim sentiments, they were being rejected by the colonial censors. So we find that the ideals of the national movement, concerns which were there with regard to the Muslim sentiments and how their relations with the princely states, they could be affected, they were also being taken care of by the colonial censors, because they had learned during the revolt of 1857 that how the princely states, they have to support the colonial rulers, as many of them did during the revolt of 1857. And Lord Canning, who was the Governor General of India in 1857, he acknowledged them to be as breakwaters in the storm during the revolt of 1857. And now the British government wanted to act judiciously to secure the loyalty of the British of the princely states, so that all sorts of concessions, they were being granted to them, so that they are in a way supportive of the colonial rule. And whenever there is a need, then they are able to support the colonial masters. And we find that some of the films which depicted the princely states in a negative manner, they were also being rejected by the colonial censors. And one of such film was Terror or Chalta Purja, which was made in 1929, and it was the first film which was seen in this particular context, where a story of an imaginary Maharaja of Kantipur and the resident, or the British resident, it was being shown. So Any film which was also concerned with the idea of with the princely states and projected the princely states in a negative manner, or the relations between the British and the princely states in a negative manner, they were being rejected by the colonial censor board. And the Bombay board, which censored the film, it made remark that the film was nothing but a parody on mannerisms of the native rulers, and the existing relations between the government and the native rulers did not permit them to release film for exhibition. The same board, Bombay board, also proscribed a film called Searchlight 1937, which on the ground that it tended to bring into disrepute the rulers of Indian princely states. So we find that these kinds of films, which were in a way concerned with the princely states and trying to project the princely states in a negative manner, they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And not only in North India, we also find that in South India as well, the zamindars and the big landlords who had supported the British during the civil disobedience movement, they were also provided protection against any kind of a cinematic attack. And a film called Raitu Bidda, which was in Telugu and which dealt with the issue of the zamindari system and rural indebtedness, it was proscribed by the magistrate of Nellore, and the government of Madras upheld his orders and banned the film throughout the province. So we find that the princely states as well as the zamindars, they were also being given some kind of a protection by the colonial censors. And we also find that many of the American films, they were championing the cause of the freedom and liberty, as I told you earlier as well. And these kinds of democratic ideas, they were also not liked by the censor authorities. And there was a film called Patriot, which was made in 1928, and this film was different from the Indian film of the same name. And this film was dealing with the theme of popular uprising and the overthrow of authority, and it was banned in United Provinces and thereafter in other provinces as well. So we find that various kinds of ideas with which the censor authorities, they were not comfortable with, these kinds of ideas, they were being rejected by them. These kind of portrayals, they were being rejected by them, and they made sure that the scenes as well as the dialogues which were inimical to the interests of the Raj, they were being rejected by by the censors. And we also find during this particular period that how the national movement was also gaining momentum from 1920s. In 1920s, thereafter we find the non-cooperation, and then we have the civil disobedience movement as well. And that is also the period we find that a film called Alamara, which was the first talkie which was made during this time, and how people, they were becoming also restless in their demand in the context of freeing themselves from the colonial rule. And we find that the coming of the talkies also provided the kind of dialogues which were needed. And with the arrival of the dialogues, many a times the kind of references which were made by the people, by the filmmakers in their dialogues, could also be indirectly related to the various concerns which were raised by the national movement as well. So in that context, the filmmakers and the technicians, we find that many of them, they were influenced by the ideals of the national movement, and they wanted some kind of a political propaganda through their films as well. And we find that during the civil disobedience movement, a large number of Indian films and the documentaries, they had trouble with the censor board or the authorities for some reason or the other. So we find that the filmmakers and the technicians, they wanted to incorporate some kind of ideals of the nationalist movement in the films as well. They wanted to do some kind of a propaganda, and some leaders like Satyamurthy, he was also a filmmaker and he was also a political leader, and he used the political propaganda in South India in the context of the elections as well. So how the Indian filmmakers, whether the other filmmakers like J.B.H. Wadia, etc., those who were making the stunt films as well, and they were also very they were also very aware regarding these issues, and many of the portrayals in their films, they were concerned with the national movement as well. And wherever the colonial censorship realized that this was happening, then it tried to resort to deletion of the dialogues, or the deletion of the scenes as well. And we find that how the commissioners of police, they had increased powers, and how they were acting as chairman of the censor board as well. And the district authorities, they were reminded to exercise their powers over cinema more frequently during this time, and because of which we find that censorship grew arbitrary, and even district magistrates, they resorted to peremptory banning of films. So this kind of a censorship, where films, they were being rejected by the commissioners of police, how the commissioner of police was also acting as the chairman of the censor board, and such kind of happenings in this context, they were not in a way conducive to the expression of the nationalist ideals during this time. And wherever such kind of a feeling was among the British authorities, then they resorted to such kind of deletions of scenes and the dialogues as well. And many times we find that how films, I talked about a film called Reth in 1931, how it was also being rejected by the local authorities. And these kinds of things, they were happening time and again in the context of the censorship authority. And there was a film called Iman Farosh, which was made in 1937, where it was being asked to omit all the cries of Inqilab Zindabad, long live the revolution, which were uttered by the crowd. And any kind of a reference, even in the non-Indian films which were concerned with patriotism or the ideals of independence, they were not being tolerated, and they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And that is how we find that they also resorted to allegory as well. And in an allegorical manner, the Indian filmmakers, they were trying to communicate the ideals of the national movement. And we also earlier talked about a film called Kismat, where there was a song called Dur Hato Hai Duniya Walo Hindustan Hamara Hai, where this reverberance of the Quit India movement in 1942 could be seen, and Dur Hato Hai Duniya Walo was equated with the Quit India movement of Gandhi as well. And we also find that during this period, not only the feature films, but there were topicals which were made during this time, and how these were banned, they were not being released. And the General of the Motion Picture Society of India, August 1937, documents that 15 films which were released for exhibition during the relaxation period of the film censorship. So all these films which were topical, they were not being released earlier, and how Gandhi was becoming more and more popular during this time with the foreign press as well as the Indian press, and how his activities, they were being covered by the press as well. And that is how more and more topicals, they were being made by the foreign news agencies, and these were rejected by the Indian colonial government, because they felt that when such kind of topicals or documentaries, they will be shown, then they will only increase Gandhi's charisma and popularity, and it will also in a way only in a way augment or increase the ideals of the national movement. They will also spread the ideals of the national movement in that context. And we also find that during the Second World War as well, many of the films, they were talking about the ideals of freedom or peace. They were also talking about the removal of untouchability, prohibition of liquor, Congress, democracy, Gandhi. So all these kinds of ideas, they were being talked about during the Second World War in various films which were made during this time. And we also find that they were also trying to communicate these kinds of ideals of the national movement and all these ideals they were trying to portray that how independence of India could now soon become a reality, and Quit India movement gave some kind of a thrust to this. And when we say that in many of the films such kind of symbols like charkha they were being used, or portraits and photographs of Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose, they were also being used. And many a times we find that these kinds of symbols they were not relevant to the story of the film, but they appeared time and again. And as I told you that there was a film called Kismat in 1943 where this आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, and this reference then there was some kind of an investigation regarding this issue as British government became alarmed because of this scene of this song, particularly when this song was again requested by the cinegoers again and again in the cinema hall to be played. And when the inspector went to investigate the matter, he suggested that there is a reference to Germans and the Japanese, that tum na kisi ke aage jhukna, German ho ya Japani. So there is not a reference to the colonial government, but there is a reference to the other nationality, Germans and the Japanese. So this was spared by the colonial government. The song was written by a poet, Pradeep, who had this kind of an awareness or understanding, and he later acknowledged also that such kind of allegory was also being utilized during this period, because British colonial censor authority was not ready to release such kind of portrayals. And we also find that in other films also such kind of portrayals they were also being made. And we find that during this particular period how during the Second World War the government policies, the way they were being framed during this period, how the Congress party and the other parties which were there in the context of the national movement, they took the rigid stand against India's participation in war, and finally they resigned from office in October 1939. And the British government assumed the draconian powers and imposed all kinds of censorship in an intensified form. So we find that the resignation of the ministries at the local level also provided some kind of a scope to the British government to extend their authority in these provinces as well, because now they will be able to control those areas as well. And the censorship authority was now in a way imposed in more stringent manner than in the earlier times. And they were also aware that how the Quit India movement was also undergoing at that point of time, and it had created some kind of revolutionary spirit among the people, and how the arrest of the major leaders of the national movement at this point of time provided some kind of a scope to the lesser known leaders, but at the same time it also invited the wrath of the public, which became quite angry with the colonial rulers, the way the Indian movement leaders they were being in a way put into prison by the colonial authorities. So we find that the colonial government, it unleashed the obnoxious censorship policy on the various films, and it also restricted the length of the feature films to 11,000 feet and the trailers to 400 feet in 1942. So we find that the availability of the material to make films also became some kind of a concern during this point of time. And how when this material was not available, and they also in a way forced the Indian filmmakers to make the war films during this time, that every third film which will be produced by them would be on an approved subject, and that approved subject has to be approved by the British. So these kinds of rules which were made by the colonial government under the Defence of India rules, where the exhibition of the 200 feet of the approved film was made compulsory for every exhibition, and the rental was also charged for these films. So we find that such kind of restrictions they became more and more stringent during this time, and the director of the war publicity was put on the censor board. to ensure that the films they contain nothing that would work against the war efforts. And 1943 government established the Information Films of India for the exclusive production of newsreels and the documentaries. So we find that the control over the control of the government over the censorship machinery, it was already there, but at the same time now the production and the exhibition was also being in a way controlled by the government, because if the rules which were being framed by the government they will not be followed, then such kind of making of films was not possible for the filmmakers. And so we find that the colonial rulers they wanted to exercise their authority in this matter. And Feroz Rangoonwala talks about that how the All India Radio was not even allowed to carry a line which referred to Mahatma Gandhi Road. So we find that even in the context of the stunt films, all sorts of censorship authority was being used, that when they were talking about the ideas of good governance, of freedom of speech and expression, democracy, victory of good over evil, all of them they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And this was happening in the context of various films as well, in the context of the films in the context of South India as well. A film called In Defense of Honor, for example, and another film called Tyag Bhumi, all of them they were in a way excised by the censor authorities. And the officials also, they were largely concerned with that. They did not want that Gandhi and the ideals of the national movement they were being shown to the masses, and how any kind of a propaganda through film in the context of the national movement should not take place. They also rejected the issues of sensuality and morality. They were in a way lenient towards such kind of issues, and even the members of the censor board they argued that British they were not concerned with these kinds of ideals. And as we know that how British they were not providing any kind of support to the Indian industry, and they were not being given any kind of encouragement or support. So that was one of the banes of the Indian cinema industry as well. So to conclude, I'd like to suggest that the colonial censorship authority was quite arbitrary in nature, and it wanted to throttle the aspirations of the Indians in the context of the ideals of the national movement, and other kinds of concerns which will prove dangerous to the colonial rule, they were also being rejected by the colonial censors. Thank you very much.